Hello, my furniture friends. I recently picked up this little mid-century bookcase from the thrift store for just $5. And while similar Danish style pieces with high quality wood veneers can sell for a pretty penny these days, this is a free gift with purchase version that was probably given out by the door-to-door salesman when a family bought the entire set of encyclopedias, and it's made from plywood and laminate. It's also missing one of its glass doors, so for me, this is the perfect candidate for a restyle. This is going to be a pretty easy makeover, but I do have a few good tricks of the furniture flipping trade to share along the way, like painting laminate and filling in deep wood grain for a nice smooth finish. But to start things off, I'm going to pull out this remaining door and put it somewhere where I won't accidentally smash it, and then give this whole thing a good clean with some simple green and hot water just to remove any old furniture polish residue, dust, and all the cobwebs that always collect on the bottom of furniture. These angled taper legs are in great condition and are the real telltale sign of mid-century modern design. So I'll definitely be cleaning these up and putting them right back where I found them. Next up is sanding. I'm using some 150 grit sandpaper, which is kind of a medium grit. Since the top surface is a slick plastic laminate, I need to scuff that up and just create a little bit of texture for my primer to grab onto. And then on the rest of the unit, I'm gonna do the same thing, just taking down that sheen and also buffing out any spots around the edges with old nicks and dings. I could leave this as an open bookcase and just fill in those tracks on the bottom, but I think these days this cabinet will be much more useful as some closed storage. We all need a spot to hide our junk. So I pulled a scrap piece of 1/8-inch thick underlayment plywood out of our shed and just had my husband cut it down into a couple of panels that are the same size as the original glass. Oh, there's snow on the inside of the shed. There are bicycles in the way. Seriously, I can't feel my fingers. Oh my God, it's like a sail. Okay. You please stay there while I close the door. This stuff usually comes in a big 4-foot by 8-foot sheet, but if you can't transport that or cut it down yourself, if you take your measurements, they'll actually do this for you right at Home Depot on their big panel saw. After making sure both pieces fit and slid in the tracks well, I gave them a quick sand down with some 220 grit because this stuff is pretty rough, and I also wanted to smooth out any little splintered spots along those cut edges. I propped the box up on a drop cloth over another little table that I've got out here in the garage, just so I didn't have to bend over quite as much. And then I busted out my go-to, pretty much all-purpose shellac-based primer. This stuff sticks to everything, so I know it's going to make a really good bond to that laminate, and it's also going to seal up the plywood sides and shelf and any bare wood spots around the frame and those doors to create one nice, consistent, unified surface for my paint to sit over top of. Since it's so sticky though, I always prefer to roll it on instead of putting it through and then having to clean it out of my sprayer. My first coat of primer really highlighted this seam between the laminate and the frame. So I grabbed some lightweight wood filler and just smeared that over the gap. And then to fill in the really noticeable wood grain on the door panels, I used the same wood filler, but I mixed it with some water just to create a brushable slurry, and then used a cheap chip brush to completely cover both of these panels. And I find it helps to brush this on going against the grain so that it really catches down into all of those little pockets. That all took about 30 minutes to dry, and then I popped some really fine 400 grit sandpaper onto my sander to start smoothing it all out. When you're smoothing out this grain filler, you really want to sand all of that beige color away so that all that's left behind is what's sitting down inside of that grain, and that'll make sure that you don't end up with any weird lumpy finish on top of the surface. I cleaned off all the dust again, just wiping it down with a microfiber rag, and then applied one more coat of primer to seal all of that in. And while that dried, I grabbed the legs and propped them up in some clamps so that I could refresh them with a little bit of this Restore finish. I don't use this stuff too often, but for these legs, they just have a couple of little nicks in them, and this stuff is going to camouflage that well enough that I don't have to completely strip them, restain them, and then reseal them. It's super easy to use. You just pour a little bit into some fine steel wool and then rub it into the finish. All right, I want to paint this thing in this beautiful, deep, purpley red hue called Winchester from Fusion Mineral Paint. But red paints traditionally have really terrible coverage. So to help me out, I'm actually going to spray a layer of gray first to use as kind of a tinted primer, which should help the red after get much better coverage and go a little further. Actually, instead of opening this new can of Little Lamb, I think I'm going to use what's left of this Newell color from my last project, and I'll just put a little bit of my already open jar of black in there and create a grayish color that I can spray on this thing. So ideally, you just use a gray primer from the start, or have your white primer tinted gray and skip this entire procedure. But I'm using what I've already got on hand, which is bright white, so I've got an extra step. I strained my gray color into my pneumatic spray gun, set my air pressure at about 40 psi, and sprayed on a quick coat over the box and the doors. That took about 2 hours to dry, and then I was finally ready to get to the exciting part of this. All right, that gray is done. I've cleaned out my sprayer and also changed my mind on the color that I want to use. I'm going to use this Highlander, which is more of a true red, whereas this Winchester is kind of a wine cranberry color. Again, I strained about half of this pint, or around 8 ounces, into my gun and added about a tablespoon of water to thin it out just a touch, and then got to work spraying on my first coat of this gorgeous scarlet red. Red and yellow pigments are always more sheer than other colors and usually need about double the coats to get a really true full coverage. But that layer of gray underneath, instead of trying to cover the bright white, should mean that I'll only need 2 coats to get the true color, instead of 3 or 4 or even 5 sometimes. After another 2 hours of dry time, I gave each surface one final smooth out with my 400 grit just to knock off any little dust specks or fuzzy bits that had dried into my paint, and then I sprayed on my second coat. legs while I was literally watching paint dry, I grabbed my antique gold rub and buff and a tiny craft brush to touch up the tips of the legs. Now, the Fusion mineral paint that I've used on here does have a really durable built-in top coat, but this is a matte paint, and I wanted to add a little bit more of a sheen to this, along with some extra protection. So I'm going to use the rest of this can of Behr's water-based poly in satin to do that. After giving it a really thorough stir and filtering it again into my cleaned out sprayer, I turned down the flow setting right on my gun by about a quarter turn of the knob, because this stuff is a much thinner consistency than the paint was, and I don't want to be spraying on too much product at once, or else I'll end up with a bunch of drips. I sprayed on 2 coats of my top coat, again, waiting about 2 hours in between. And I get asked all the time about overspray because I don't use a spray booth or any kind of shelter. And the fact of the matter is I do end up with a layer of dust on everything in the garage, which is even more apparent when I spray with a color like this red. Should I build myself a booth? Yes. Will I ever get around to doing that? Probably not. Once the poly was nice and dry, all that was left to do was screw the legs back in and figure out some hardware for the doors. I dug through my enormous collection of handles and knobs and found these 2 gold rectangular guys that should work. I stacked the doors right on top of each other with an extra board underneath, measured out where I wanted the knobs to go, and then just drilled straight through both doors at once. Now, the screws for these were way too long to use on these super thin doors, so I grabbed a couple of these easy cut bolts instead, and I just used my side cutters to snap them off at their shortest marking. I did do this inside of a plastic bag though, so that I didn't lose any pieces when it snapped off and went flying, because stuff goes flying when you're cutting these. Don't ask me how I know. Here is one more look at the little unit that we started with, and here is the after. I love how this red turned out. It's such a statement piece now and can be worked into a room with a nice modern vintage flair and accessorized however the new owner sees fit. I love that there's plenty of room to hide a mess, or you could even leave a door popped open for a peek at a beautiful collection of books or trinkets too. I hope you had fun working through this project with me. I'm going to leave a few more colorful furniture flips here for you to watch next if you want, and I will catch you all next time.